In today's video, we'll be looking at a Canadian aircraft carrier, the only one Canada owned outright and wasn't loaned by the British, HMCS Bonaventure, a ship best known for how insane her pilots could be, especially on landing. We'll get to that later. First, let's look at where her story started, which in this case was a long and winding path to completion. The ship that became Bonaventure was laid down on November 27, 1943, by Harland and Wolff, as HMS Powerful, a Majestic-class carrier. At least at first, her construction progressed at normal speed. Powerful was launched on February 27, 1945, just a bit over a year after the keel was laid. However, things ground to a halt during the fitting out. When the Second World War ended in August 1945, construction stopped. By no means was Powerful unique. Quite a few of the light fleet carriers were laid up with the end of the war. The British were drawing down. This resulted in HMS Powerful languishing for several years, until in 1952, an unlikely buyer approached. The Royal Canadian Navy, building up for the Cold War, purchased the incomplete hull on April 23rd of 1952. This was seen as a cheaper option than either a Centaur class from the British or a loan of two Essex class from the Americans. With this settled, Powerful was moved to a dock to finish her fitting out, with the ship modernized during this process with the intention of operating modern aircraft. In this regard, having a mostly empty hull was definitely a good thing. It was relatively easier to modernize. A modernization that focused on aircraft handling, the most visible aspect being an angled flight deck, which at the time was still a relatively new innovation. This was matched by an optical landing system and new steam catapults, as well as larger elevators and a strengthened flight deck, all to make the ship capable of operating jet aircraft, at least to some extent. No amount of modification could change the fact this was a small ship, by the standards of the Cold War. More specifically, the carrier displaced about 16,250 tons at her standard loading. This rose to 20,300 at the full load, with a length of 629 feet on the waterline. The flight deck, meanwhile, came out to 704 feet or 215 meters. By means of comparison, a long-hull Essex was 888 feet long, and that's before any modernization. This led to a small air wing of only 36 aircraft, and only 16 of those were actually jet aircraft, which we'll touch on later. The ship was also on the slower end, 24.5 knots on 40,000 shaft horsepower. That just leaves two things to cover. First, the defensive weaponry. This consisted of 8 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, American weaponry to replace the originally planned Bofors, in this case in 4 twin mounts. Another modification made in light of jet aircraft, in this case the fact they were far faster and needed to be engaged at longer range. As for the last modernization, that came with the electronics. The Canadian carrier was fitted with American radar mounted to a lattice mast. This mast, plus a raked-back funnel, made for a distinctive silhouette. When all these modifications were finalized, construction resumed. This would ultimately finish on January 17th of 1957. Almost 12 years after she was launched, Powerful finally entered service, under the new name of HMCS Bonaventure. She would sail to Canada on June 19th, carrying her air wing and an unusual passenger, that being an experimental hydrofoil on her flight deck. Not the strangest thing an aircraft carrier has been used to transport, but certainly up there. In any event, as Bonnie entered service with the Canadian fleet, she primarily took up a training and patrol role. With the Korean War over in 1953, there were no active conflicts to serve in, at least none that would involve Canada. Instead, Bonaventure spent her initial service on working up her pilots and crew. This wasn't unusual, of course, but there were some quirks to this particular ship, namely her small size. Despite all the modernizations, operating jet aircraft remained a difficult prospect. Bonaventure entered service with 16 McDonnell F-2H Banshees. This was a bit outdated by 1957, to be fair. A straight-wing fighter that originated in the late 1940s, but it remained a powerful jet fighter and a rather large one. Both of those factors made operating the aircraft a bit of an interesting endeavor. Bonaventure was on the very edge of large enough to handle the Banshee. Clearances were so tight, particularly on landing, that American pilots were baffled by it, and considered their Canadian counterparts to be just a little bit crazy. In fairness, if Bonaventure had been even slightly smaller, those Banshees wouldn't have fit. Certainly not in landing. Even takeoff wasn't entirely safe, as a Banshee was lost on February 25, 1958, and another was lost in landing on March 4th. However, this is what the Canadians had, and they made it work, even to the point of fitting early sidewinders to try and improve the offensive punch of the old fighters. The rest of the air wing was substantially more mundane. Grumman trackers for anti-submarine work, and Sikorsky HO-4S helicopters for much the same role. Once this air group was suitably worked up, Bonaventure shifted to other work. Although this wasn't that different in the long run. The carrier would spend 1958 through 1962 on various training exercises, sometimes with other Canadian ships, but often with NATO partners, particularly the Royal Navy and United States Navy. For example, in March 1958, Bonaventure performed cross-deck operations with the British, specifically HMS Bulwark, a larger Centaur-class ship. Bonaventure would launch and recover Sea Venoms and Sea Hawks. Bulwark would perform touch-and-go landings with the Banshees. This kind of pattern would persist for the rest of the ship's early service. Bonaventure sailed from the Canadian coast to Britain and to the Mediterranean. In each case, it was generally part of some NATO exercise. Valuable work, to be certain, but not the most exciting thing. Although there were moments of excitement, such as persistent issues with the arrestor gear. This ranged from poor oiling to outright breakages, often from botched landings by the heavy trackers or Banshees. By October of 1959, only one wire was functional. Fortunately, this would be fixed in November before any accidents could occur. Unfortunately for Bonaventure, that would be the least of her worries. On December 6, 1959, the carrier sailed into a massive storm. Waves reached over 20 meters, 66 feet high, lashing at the flight deck. One even busted a window on the compass platform. Further difficulty came when the forward elevator was knocked down by a foot. This allowed water into the hangar until the crew could raise and secure the lift. As if this weren't enough, the bow was also damaged by the force of the waves. Bonaventure wasn't at real risk of sinking, but the ship didn't exactly have a fun time. Because of this damage, she was in refit from January to March of 1960, at which point the ship returned to her old duty, with a break to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Navy. For the rest of 1960 through 1962, Bonaventure continued her usual work. There were breaks, like helping fight forest fires in August 1961, as well as two notable landings in mid-1962. First on April 16th, when an American pilot on exchange duty made the 10,000th landing aboard the ship, and then on May 10th, when the final Banshee landing took place. After that, it was back to training until September 30th, 1962, when the Banshees were taken off the ship for good. Bonaventure lost her fighters and shifted entirely to anti-submarine warfare. And then a month later, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a real issue. Bonaventure, moored in Britain, was ordered to rush home. She left in such a hurry that 20 or so crewmen were left behind on leave. In fact, Bonaventure left dock within 6 hours. She would arrive back in Canada on November 2nd before taking up patrol duty. By November 18th, things had cooled down enough that Bonaventure could return to port. She wouldn't leave again before a refit in January 1963. This should have taken 3 months, but after leaving refit, a boiler explosion put her right back in dock. For 6 weeks, as it turned out. Bonaventure only rejoined the fleet properly in July 1963. For, as you can probably guess, yet more training, with a difference coming in her air wing, now featuring the more capable Sea King helicopter. This would continue until 1964, where 2 things of note happened. The first in March of 1964, when Bonaventure carried Canadian peacekeepers to Cyprus. Then in early May, the ship conducted trials with the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk, a possible replacement for the old Banshee. By all indications, this was successful. However, for budget reasons, the Canadian government declined the option. The rest of 1964 and all of 1965 was pretty standard for the ship. Nothing truly major to note here. 1966 was much the same until the ship entered into a massive overhaul in April. This was a midlife upgrade that ran into late 1967. Bonaventure rejoined the Canadian fleet in November 1967, fresh and ready for a long service life. As it would turn out, this wouldn't happen. In 1968, the Royal Canadian Navy ceased to exist as an independent force. The Canadian forces, land, sea, and air, were unified into the new Canadian Armed Forces. Bonaventure would continue on, at least at first, despite the change in organization. However, she wouldn't last long. Bonaventure would have a few more exercises from 1968 through 1970, including visits to foreign ports, up to and including visiting New Orleans. Unfortunately, in 1969, the announcement came through that Bonaventure was surplus to requirement. The ship would perform a few more exercises before her last landing on December 12th of 1969. Bonaventure would endure into early 1970 as a transport and replenishment oiler. This would be a short reprieve. The carrier was decommissioned on July 3rd, 1970, and then sold for scrap in March 1971, ultimately ending her days in a Taiwanese scrapyard. This remains a controversial decision, and understandably so. Bonnie had just come out of an extensive midlife overhaul, and the ship had proven capable of operating Skyhawks. Instead, a couple years after her refit, the ship was gone. And to this day, the Canadian Navy has never operated another aircraft carrier of any sort. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.